So, Charles, you want to go with this?
Thanks, Ron. Good evening. I'm Charles Cartier. I was the senior manager on the audit this year with the Matt Montalvo, a partner in Fresh Monkey, filling in for Luke Malecki, who's the engagement partner on this job, who's currently off this week. So this is going to serve as the official audit presentation for the year ended December 31, 2020. In essence of time, I'm going to jump right in. So I'm very first ready for the presentation. And I gave everyone a copy of the draft financial statements. You have a few. We do plan to move ahead in issuing these reports shortly next week. We have some quality control to do on our end to get the file going and the audit ready to go. Luke's signature when he gets back. We'll be ready to issue this week. So on the very first slide here, products for our audit, there's really 4 documents that are issued as part of what we're hired to do. The first one being the basic financial statements. Obviously, we are hired to provide an opinion that the financial statements fairly present the financial position of the town and the revenues and expenditures or the activity as of and for the year ended December 31, 2020. We want to make sure that they're free of material misstatement and that they can be relied upon by outside users, whether it be your banks, lenders, residents, any users. So we do plan, they are in draft form, but we do plan to move ahead next week and issue an unmodified opinion, which is the best opinion that you can get. It's free of any qualifications and that they actually can be relied upon. The other report or opinion that we put in the financial statements, so the financial statement opinion is at the very front. The other opinion that is our document is the report on internal control in accordance with government auditing standards. So that allows us or requires us to disclose any potential reportable findings as they relate to deficiencies in internal control. And we'll cover that later on in the observation sections. So essentially, out of the 90-page document that you have in front of you, 5 comes from us, 85 or so essentially comes from the town's fair presentation and preparation. We help compile it, but they are your responsibility. The second product that we deliver here is the management letter. That's not a required communication, but it's historically issued to provide any other internal control, operational matters, any best practices that we see as we work with dozens of municipalities across the county, across the state. So when we see best practices, we like to include in the management letter and any future reporting requirements in the form of GASB pronouncements or governmental accounting standards for pronouncement when even due. The third bullet here is the auditor communication letters. Auditor's communication letter, that is our required documentation that we'll talk about down on the next slide. And the very last report that we're hired to provide is the departmental report. So we audit the town justices, town clerk, tax receiver, and provide opinions that those are fairly stated as well. We also do audits of the youth, rec, and senior center. We don't provide an opinion on them, but we do test their receipts and disbursements, and if there would be any control matters or any deficiencies, we'd include them in the town management letter financials. So as part of our required communications on the next slide, the very first one, what our responsibility is and what management's responsibility is when it comes to town management, when it comes to these financial statements. As I said before, our responsibility is to make sure that the financial statement fairly present the financial position of the town. We run a series of tests to ensure that they are free of material statement. The town management responsibility is to provide us with information that ensures that these financial statements, as they come to us for audit, they are prepared fairly and that they are free of internal deficiencies. The second bullet here is significant accounting policies. That's another required communication. This year there were 3 new GASB pronouncements, what I refer to as governmental accounting standards board pronouncements. Those affect the way financials look from year to year, depending on what kind of pronouncements came out. This year, only 3 of them had to be implemented, and they were, but they had no impact on the way financial statements looked this year compared to how they looked last year. So there's nothing to be concerned about as far as GASBs for 12/31/20. All the accounting policies are disclosed in Note 1 financial statements, should you want to read more into those. And then one other required documentation this year, required communication this year is there is a restatement as far as other post-employment benefits, or OPEB, as it's developed by the actuary. So it is an estimate. It doesn't affect your operating budget. It's one of those long-term liability, long-term estimate that's going to come due 30 years from now, or legacy costs. So it doesn't change how you currently budget for your townwide operation. Other significant accounting estimates that we have to disclose on as they impact financial statements. Some could be significant. Those are compensated absences, your net pension liabilities, workers' compensation, judgments and claims. There's limited procedures that we can do as auditors on those accounting estimates, so we have to rely on actuaries that prepare documents for us, or third parties, and we just run a series of assumptions to make sure that they're consistent with what the market is doing. And all of those estimates were deemed to be reasonable as far as our procedures are concerned. And once again, all these items affect your long-term liabilities and don't affect the way you currently budget for the cost. Independence, that's every year we disclose that we are independent of the town. Myself, Luke, all our staff members that are on the engagement, and anyone within our firm. Other matters here, if our scope was limited during the audit, or if there had been disagreements or significant misstatements, we'd be required to disclose them. There were no such significant matters to be disclosed in this auditor's communication. Going more on the financial outlook, the next slide, town governmental revenues and expenditures. This just takes a snapshot, high level of all your funds, not just general fund, but all of them. And what you want to see in this case is, when we show these trends of 5 years ago and where we are today, you want to see that your blue line, which is your revenues, matches your red line. Basically that it's right on top of it, or just a little higher, a little lower, but there's no high peaks and valleys. And as you can see, there's very sound budgeting over the last 5 years, where your revenues have exceeded your expenditures by, on an average, $600,000 from year to year, which, if you compare that to a town-wide $35 million budget, you're at less than 2% budget variation, which is pretty good, considering there's most you can change from one year to the other. So, once again, this is more high level, than what we focus on here is more the general fund. So if you turn to the next page, similarly to what I just talked about, your blue line, you want to see it right on your red line. And from 2016 to 2018, that's exactly what the state or the USC wants when they come in and they do their audits. They want to make sure that the town's not raising too much revenues and accumulating, they call it fund balance, or that you're not generating enough revenues to meet your expenditures. So in 2016, 2018, exactly what they want to see. They want to see years where you're going over, they want to see years where you're going under that red line, but at the end of the day, they also want to make sure that you're staying consistent. And that's what you see from 16 to 18. In 2019, there was a little hike there in expenditures. 2019 expenditures for the general fund were $10.7 million. The number's not listed there, but that increase was mainly due to the reassessment project that happened in 19. And then your highway, there was some roof work on the highway and some of the parks. So those were one-time costs that caused that red line to increase a little bit. But had that not increase happened, your red line is right on path, direct line from 16 to 20. So your total revenues at December 31, 2020, the far right, the blue line, $10.7 million. Total expenditures, $10.5 million, that red line. So you generated $160,000 of fund balance in 2020. That excess fund balance was mainly caused by an increase in state and federal aid. Your state aid were mortgage tax, which we saw across the county, higher than expected. And then your federal aid, this year you actually recorded federal aid for CARES Act, which wasn't recorded in prior years. So that was the reason for the increase in revenues. On the expenditure side, decreased to $10.5 million in 2020. We talked about the one-time cost in 2019 reassessment projects and those roofs, which caused expenditures to go back to the trend that they were originally on from 16 to 18. Obviously, the roof didn't happen, and there was some freeze in culture and recreation, which caused expenditures to go down the general fund. Those savings were offset by the $400,000 additional payment that was approved in the form of the bond payment to pay off the early 2005 bond. So we generated $160,000 in 2020. Total fund balance at the end of December 31, 2020 was $3.6 million. Of that 3.6, only $2.5 million is actually unassigned, which is available for free spending at the town's discretion. $2.5 million represents 23% of your general fund expenditures and transfers out. So when you look at an earmark of, do I have too much, too little, it's really up to this group to decide what's too much, too little. There's some best practices out there that say 25, 20. Government finance says it's reasonable to have 2 months worth of operating expenditures, which would be around 17%, but that's at the town's discretion. And once again, Ultra and Rec this year saw savings of $600,000, which programs were frozen. Had that not taken place, that $2.5 million unassigned fund balance would have been more at the lower level of where your the G4 recommendation.
Yeah, and the GFOA states that at a minimum, you want to have essentially 2 months of operating expenses, because as you know, as a government, you're waiting on tax revenues. That money isn't available day one, but you have to pay your operating expenses. So as you're waiting for your sales tax and your property taxes to come in, you need to have a cushion of cash to essentially fund the operations. So they recommend a minimum of 2 months.
So I'm trying to go quick. I know that we're limited on time. Is there any questions before I move forward in any other funds and the observations at the end? General fund wise? No. Okay, next slide. We've got the police fund, another major fund. Once again, I mean, you want the blue line to match the red line. And over a 5-year trend, you see 2016 to 2019, you're right where you want to be. In 2019, your revenues were $10.4 million. Expenditures were also $10.4 million. In 2020, that red line expenditures went up to $10.5 million. But that once again, it goes straight line from 2016 to 2018. That's a $170,000 increase from 19 to 20, which on a $10 million budget, that's 1.7%, which follows with the inflation rate, which your police fund is mainly driven by the labor costs. So if you're following inflation there, there's nothing that there's nothing out of the ordinary there on the expenditure. On the revenue line, obviously you saw a decrease in 2020. The revenues went to $10 million, whereas they were $10.4 million in 2019. Obviously, the decrease this year was the result of the sales tax that didn't come to fruition. We expected it to be way worse than it was, and ended up being a lot more positive than it ended. So that decrease in your financial statements you'll see is not only in non-property taxes, but it's also in intergovernmental charges because you get a portion from the village. So that sales tax was hit at a rate of $380,000. So at the end of 2020, the police fund ended up using $500,000. They had $2.8 million to begin the year. They ended up at 12/31/2020 at $2.3 million in fund balance. Of that $2.3 million, $1.8 million is actually available to spend as unassigned fund balance, we call it, and that represents 17% of your expenditures for the year. Next slide, the highway fund. You see a little more of those peaks and valleys here, but at the end of the day, in 2016, the blue line, your revenues were $4.5 million. Your expenditures were $4.2 million. 2020, you're at the exact same amounts. So although you went up in 17, down in 18, up in 19, at the end of the day, you're right where you were in 2016. We expect to see some of these peaks and valleys in such a fund. The highway fund oftentimes will incur some large equipment needs, trucks, saw purchases depending on the year that they're needed. So it's common to see these hikes and valleys here. In 2019, compared to 2018, or 2020 compared to 2019, you had a loss of $280,000 in revenues. Last year, you had recorded a large waste reduction and recycling grant, which wasn't needed this year. And obviously, with COVID happening, the red line, your expenditures went down from $5 million to $4.2 million. So an $800,000 decrease in expenditures because of the costs that were controlled or deferred because of the COVID-19 pandemic of where it was going to be, where it was going to end up. So at the end of the day, that fund, highway fund, generated $320,000 of fund balance, of which you ended 12/31/2020 at $2.4 million of total fund balance in this fund, 1.5 of which is assigned for specific use, which you have available. That represents 31% of your expenditures and transfers out. So we all consider, for all your funds, your major funds, we all consider what you have available fund balance-wise is reasonable. Once again, it's like a level of comfort of the board as far as what's enough, what's too much, what's not enough, but on our end, we're right where you would like to be. Observations-wise, I made reference earlier on the internal controls as far as they relate to the output of the financial data that goes in financial statements. This year, we do have a reportable finding as it relates to bank reconciliations and year-end audit preparedness, and as they relate to journal entries at the end of the day. The findings you look at, they're listed in the back of the draft financial statements. So it's the last part of the opinion. So the very first part, bank reconciliations and year-end audit preparedness, really discusses when we came in for the audit in March and April to prepare for the state report and the audit, there was some bank reconciliations that hadn't been done for several months. The lack of bank reconciliations being performed led to some unreconciled cash balances, which ended up being reconciled throughout the audit process. With that said, we never want to see bank reconciliations not being performed in a timely manner. We want to make sure that there's an audit trail, that it's done in a timely manner, and that journal entries are performed when bank reconciliations are performed. And not only are they performed, but they're reviewed. So we want to make sure that someone is available to not only perform, but a separate individual that has those skill set can also review it, maintain segregation of duties. And what we noticed, that the part that we talked about year-end audit preparedness, really when we come into audit, we want to audit records that are full, complete, and as accurate as possible. We fully expect that there will be audit journal entries that we perform procedures. Certain items are new. There's new grants out there, and we usually help municipalities record those grants. But there was a significant increase in journal entries this year compared to previous years, which places some undue reliance on us as auditors. With that said, there is no uncorrected in the statements. All unreconciled balances ended up being corrected. And so we just want to make sure that the process moving forward is consistent, and reconciliations are done, they're reviewed, and journal entries are reported in a timely manner so that financial output that's being created by the inputs in the system as journal entries are put in is correct and accurate and timely.
Are reconciliations up to date for 2020 as of now?
As far as these financial statements, there are no longer any unreconciled balances, which would lead that to tell me that bank reconciliations are performed. I would defer to Pam to make sure if they're done in a timely manner or if they're done as of 12/31/2020. So
it doesn't carry over into 2021. You know, there's nothing, everything was done as of the end of 2020. So we're up to date as far as that goes. Okay.
So the main point of this is we want to make sure that the process is consistent moving forward. Okay. So if they're done as of 12/31/2020, it's still not sufficient. We'll remove this comment next year when we come back to audit. If the December 31, 2020 bank reconciliation or 2021 has been performed. So we want to make sure the process is consistent. We offer our recommendations in one of the last bullets up there, and then management has the opportunity to provide corrective action plans in the bottom part. So once again, that's on draft form. We'll ask that the town review it, okay it, and then we'll do our end as well. So that's where we stand on this particular plan. On the second page, there's also what we call reportable instance of non-compliance. That's nothing new. That was there in the past couple of years. Essentially, that just takes Town Law, Article 8, Section 117, which says that you can't exceed, you can't have a financial statement line, budgetary appropriation line that exceeds your budget. So when your expenditure exceeds your budget at the end of the day, and there's no transfers or amendments that were made on that particular line, town law requires us as auditors to put a reportable instance of non-compliance. It's carried forward from prior years. It's been there in the past, it's nothing new. So the quick fix there is that your total budgetary spending came in below budget, so year-end transfers between account lines could have avoided that. So moving forward, if the town wants to do it on a time basis, subsequent to year-end, it doesn't have to be received before the end of the year. You don't know where you're going to be. You have the ability to do so.
We got to do that by resolution.
Yes. As also, I talked as well earlier on the management letter that we issue. We are also going to issue one this year. We do every year. It's not only internal control, it's also best practices, as I mentioned. First thing is I want to commend the town on certain improvements. One, petty cash at the senior center is a comment that we've included for as long as I've worked on the audit now. But the senior center would use some of their petty cash to make small disbursements. As it came due, we had a comment over the years to make sure that the senior center follows the town-wide disbursement process, and that's seen some significant improvements. So that comment that's been carried for several years now is no longer in the management letter. Additionally, 2 years ago now, we had a comment on the accumulation of funds in those miscellaneous special revenue funds, mainly recreation pipeline fees, and the funds have been accumulated, fund balance kept growing. It is a non-major fund. It doesn't attract the eye because it's not presented on the front financial statements. But the town did start spending that down in 2019 and even more in 2020. Specifically, I think Westwood Park or the Walden Ponds and the Meadowview Park. That money was used there. And then the one thing too that we've added for years is in the management letter is a general comment on capital assets being maintained in-house by the finance department, centralized where it keeps track of every single assets that are added, gives it a depreciable life, and accounts for how to add additions on the books and how to dispose of them. There's never been any formal policy. We've had a recommendation to do so. And although it will still be included at 12/31/2020, because it wasn't there when we started, I've been involved on some of the munis trainings on using that module. So we do work with a lot of municipalities that use munis. Not everyone maximizes their use of all the modules that they offer. The town of Lancaster here seems to be involved, and they're populating that module as we speak. So it seems like this comment's going to go away in future years, and that's a comment that since 2013 has been there. So I wanted to comment on that. We're going to use the management letter to, once again, I talked about capital assets. I still have a short paragraph there. We're going to consider a comment on succession planning with some of the transition that has occurred this year, or a couple years ago now, but we saw the impacts on internal controls as referenced in our reportable finding there. So we'll make sure that there's something in place that documents what happens if one or multiple key positions of the town have to leave again, and what's the plan to make sure that operation keeps going as speed as possible. And we'll also consider including some language on best practices as they relate to the new money, the American Rescue Plan, remote workings, possibly what we still have to finalize that part of best practices. So, any questions?
So we don't have a formal policy on reconciliations, and that's your recommendation that we create a formal policy on that?
Yeah, I think formal policy, identifying the positions that are going to be responsible to do them, identifying individuals that are going to be responsible to review the bank reconciliation, and then putting a timestamp on it. We want it done within 30 days. We want it done. Is going to add accountability on those positions. It's going to add some to job duty that already exists. And you start with policy, and then if the policy isn't followed, then you have something to use in the future.
Can I say anything?
Yes.
I'm the town clerk and tax receiver. What you're referencing has nothing to do with my two offices, am I correct?
It does not.
Thank you.
So from our standpoint, we've taken on a lot of calls. We're doing things that haven't been done in years. And you mentioned Munis. That system is going to bring us to current, and it really sets us up for the future. You know, there's a budget program that's going out first. Now accounts receivable, we go in there, our payroll, we go through there. This is something that was badly needed. And yeah, our office is taking a little bit of hit, we're understaffed for sure. So there are some corrections that are coming into place to address all these issues. But I think, you know, I believe it's a good 3 to 3.5 people that back offices in towns our size. We're on budget, we're operating with 2.5 people right now. So, you know, and it's, you know, again, my staff, that back office, has been in training with Munis. I can't even tell you the hundreds of hours that they've invested already with this. So, are we taking a hit now? Yeah. But when you look at it down the road, when it's all implemented, you're going to be in much better shape than, you know, than waiting for a system to crash and then basically scary and trying to keep the town up and running.
Any other questions, comments? My information is on the last slide here. Luke Malecki is the engagement partner, is also on the last slide. I'm more than happy to take any questions, comments later on. We are still planning on issuing next week. So if anything comes along, if you guys get a chance to review these financial statements and have something catch your eye, please feel free to let us know. We are
Do you see any summary budget, like monthly forms from other towns that we could use as an example for what we're looking for? Because I've gotten some things there, you know, there's a lot of information in there. I'm looking for something more of a snapshot. But then you see that in other towns that maybe you could send our way and just for the use of the town board itself.
I would have to use my resources. We do work with multiple municipalities. We also have the opportunity to be finance or bookkeepers for some towns, smaller towns in the area. And so I can work with our staff that does bookkeeping to see what kind of report they can generate, or if they have summaries, or if they have contacts with other bookkeepers to see what can be provided.
You're talking like budget monitoring?
Yeah, so, instead of getting
Analysis.
142 pages or whatever, we can see like in a couple of pages that we spent this amount in here, or we took this amount, somehow we didn't reach into the general fund, that type of thing. So we can get that.
Yeah, we can look at some of the different templates out there and get them over to you guys.
It's kind of practical for law, but once we install Munis, council members will be able to go in and create whatever report they would like
Absolutely.
to their likings. I mean,
You're going to be able to go in, you're going to be
information.
able to see everything. If you want to go in there daily, you can go in daily. You'll have read-only access, so you can't change anything. But you'll be able to go in and run whatever report you want, play with it. You can't break it. So
Okay.
I encourage you to do that and get yourself familiar with it, because it is what the town will be using going forward.
Yeah, and let me ask you a question, then when we're talking about like the general fund, this is, you know, important to me to see if we ever have to reach in there for any reason. That's what I was looking for, some type of a monthly report that, hey, we had to dip into the general fund, so our we have 2.5.
$2.5 million on us.
You know, we reached in and we took 200,000 out of there or something. It's just, that's the
You
type of
look
thing
for
I'd like to see.
any kind of budget transfers.
Yeah,
Or, I mean,
not for all the general fund, tax money coming in, spent, all the
Right,
departments, I
yeah.
just wanna see this reserve, and if we're hitting it for any reason whatsoever, so if we could do something for that, that'd be great.
right, we don't do that on a regular basis, so it's rare to do it, and as, I think Charles said, that we didn't hit fund balance at all. We appropriated fund balance to help with the budget, you know, just in case cushion, but we didn't use it, which is a good thing,
Yeah, exactly.
so.
Okay.
But, you know, there are things that, like, for example, the police department that used a good chunk of their, you know, $500,000 of their fund balance because they didn't get the sales tax, and their department relies on that sales tax to fund their department. So because it didn't come in where it was, you know, where we thought it would, and who knew with COVID, what was going to happen. And that's why that early in the year, I was saying, please back off on your spending. We need to be conservative because we don't know what those numbers are going to be to shake out. And, you know, police department felt the crunch.
I think at this point, it's kind of 7 o'clock, before we conduct our meeting, but thank you, gentlemen, for the overview. Again, we're very good through the whole process, and anybody has any questions, feel free to give a comment.